October 25th, 1944. The waters east of Leyte Gulf, Philippines. 24 Japanese aircraft are flying toward the American fleet, and the men in their cockpits have already written their last words to the people they love. The aircraft are Zeros. Not the Zero of Pearl Harbor and Midway, not the aircraft that had dominated the Pacific's air war for the first year and a half of fighting in the hands of pilots who had accumulated hundreds of hours of training and dozens of combat missions in the specific hardening process that converts a skilled aviator into a combat veteran. But the same design, aging now, unchanged in its essential specifications since 1940, while the aircraft opposing it has been redesigned from combat experience to specifically address the Zero's capabilities and counter them. Slower relative to what opposes it than it had been in 1941, because what opposes it has grown faster in the intervening years, while the Zero's power plant remains the same Nakajima Sake engine that launched the aircraft into combat at Pearl Harbor. The men in the cockpits are crewed not by the veterans of carrier training programs that had once produced the finest naval aviators in the world, but by young men who in most cases have been flying for less than 100 hours, directed from flight training programs that have been compressed to a fraction of their pre-war duration by the attrition that has consumed the veteran pilots in the Solomons campaign and at Midway and in the Rabaul battles, and who understand with a clarity that their training has done nothing to soften and that the specific nature of their mission has made unmistakable, that the flight they are beginning today has no return leg. They carry 550-pound bombs affixed to their fuselages by engineering modifications that have been specifically designed to prevent the bombs from being released in flight. They are the bomb, and the target is the American escort carrier fleet of Taffy 3 under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, whose flight decks, if the Zero pilots can reach them in their final steep approach, will ignite in a fire that no damage control team on a lightly armored escort carrier has the equipment or the structural margin to contain. Their commander is Lieutenant Yukio Seki, a 23-year-old carrier pilot who has been told he was chosen for this mission because he is the best available pilot, and who has accepted the mission with a public composure that, in the private account he gives to a journalist in the hours before takeoff, conceals something more complicated and more important than composure. He is not afraid. He is not enthusiastic. He is a professional who has been given an order by an institution whose authority over his life, his culture, and his training, and his specific personal history have made it almost impossible for him to refuse, and he is executing that order with the professionalism that his training demands and the private complexity of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and has not been given the opportunity to refuse it. The journalist to whom he speaks in the hours before his takeoff, Ryuji Nagatsuka, records in his post-war memoir that Seki's composure was the composure of a man who had accepted something irreversible. Not the composure of conviction or of faith or of the idealized warrior spirit that the program's official communications describe as the emotional foundation of the Toko pilot's willingness. It was the composure of someone who has worked through every available option and found that none of them leads anywhere that his conception of himself as a Japanese officer and a man formed by his specific culture and relationships can tolerate, and who has therefore arrived at the only option that the available architecture of his life permits. Nagatsuka writes that he asked Seki whether he died for the emperor, or for Japan, or for his family. Seki replied, after a pause, that he died for his beloved wife. The answer was not what official communication had prepared for, and it is not the answer that appears in any official account of the first Toko mission's leadership. It is the answer that Nagatsuka records, and it is the answer that matters for understanding what was actually happening in those cockpits on October 25th, 1944. On October 25th, 1944, Lieutenant Seki and 5 of his pilots strike the escort carrier, USS St. Lo, penetrating its flight deck and detonating the aircraft and munitions in its hangar, sinking the vessel and killing 114 of its crew. The kamikaze program has achieved its first success. What comes next? The expansion of the Toko Special Attack Program to encompass thousands of pilots flying thousands of missions over the following 8 months. The letters those pilots write in the hours before their flights, the specific things they find worth saying to the people they are leaving, is one of the most disturbing and most revealing documents that any war has produced about the human capacity to sustain individual dignity inside an institutional machinery that has decided to expend human beings as weapons. To understand what Japanese pilots were writing in their final letters to their families in the autumn of 1944 and through 1945, you have to understand the specific military context that made those letters final. The Toko, short for Tokotai, Special Attack Corps, program did not emerge from a Japanese military tradition of suicide tactics, despite the post-war narrative that frames it as the natural expression of Bushido warrior culture. It emerged from a specific tactical crisis. The recognition, by September 1944, that Japanese naval aviation no longer possessed the trained pilots and the technologically competitive aircraft that conventional air attack required to consistently penetrate American fleet defenses and deliver effective damage. The F6F Hellcat, deployed in numbers from mid-1943 onward and operated by an increasingly experienced cadre of American naval aviators, backed by a pilot training pipeline that Japanese attrition could not reduce to the levels the Japanese training pipeline was itself experiencing, had made the conventional air attack on an American carrier task force a mission from which return was becoming increasingly unlikely, even for the most experienced Japanese pilots available. For pilots whose training had given them 100 hours or fewer, and by late 1944, these were the pilots the program had available. A conventional attack on a Hellcat-defended fleet was, in the operational assessment of every senior Japanese naval aviator who examined the situation honestly, a one-way mission that produced minimal damage in exchange for the aircraft and pilot consumed. The Toko program, in the brutal arithmetic of this assessment, exchanged one-way missions for one-way missions, but added the certainty of impact that a guided weapon provides over a dropped bomb. A pilot flying directly into a ship's deck is a guidance system that no amount of anti-aircraft fire can reduce to zero probability of impact in the final seconds of the dive. Vice Admiral Onishi Takejiro, commanding the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines in October 1944, with approximately 100 operational aircraft against an American carrier force whose fighter direction system and Hellcat combat air patrols have demonstrated the ability to intercept and destroy conventional air attacks at rates that Japanese available pilot quality cannot survive for any sustained period, proposes the organized Toko program to his staff on October 19th in a meeting that produces, according to the post-war testimony of officers who attended it, a response ranging from professional agreement to private reservations that no one present is in a position to express as objection. The authorization Onishi receives from the Naval General Staff, communicated through the specific chain of approval that Japanese military command structure requires for an operational program whose novelty goes beyond anything existing doctrine addresses, arrives in a form that is simultaneously formal and improvised, since no existing doctrine can authorize something that has no precedent in Japanese military history, and since the Naval General Staff does not wish to create a formal doctrine for something whose implications, if examined in the full light of what they represent about Japan's strategic situation, would be difficult to communicate to the Japanese public or to the lower levels of the military establishment, who are not cleared for the assessments that make the program's operational rationale comprehensible. The authorization produces, 6 days later, Lieutenant Seki's flight. Onishi himself, by his own later account, and by the testimony of staff officers who were present at the October 19th meeting, where the program was authorized, does not believe the Toko program will decide the war. He believes it will buy enough time, perhaps 6 months, perhaps a year, and impose enough cost on the American fleet that Japan's diplomatic position at the end of the war might be less than total defeat, might produce some form of negotiated outcome that preserved something of Japan's sovereignty and something of the institutional structures, including the imperial institution itself, that Japanese political culture identified as non-negotiable. He is wrong about this too, in the specific way that men who design systems for consuming other people tend to be wrong about what the systems they design will actually produce, focused on the operational output of the system, measurable in ships struck and American casualties imposed, and inattentive to what the system costs in the specific human terms that the men operating it pay in full. Onishi survives the war, unlike the men his program consumed, and on August 16, 1945, the day after Emperor Hirohito announces Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that most Japanese have never heard his voice before, Onishi commits ritual suicide by disembowelment in his Tokyo residence, leaving a written apology to the spirits of the Toko pilots and their families. He takes 15 hours to die, refusing medical attention in a final act whose motives were a combination of personal shame and the specific cultural logic of a man who understood that he had sent thousands of men to die in a program that did not achieve its stated objective, and who believed that the appropriate response to this failure was his own death. The apology he leaves does not provide a framework that makes what he did comprehensible in any terms that its victims and their families have found satisfactory. It provides only the documentation that he understood at the end that it needed to be apologized for. The letters that Japanese Toko pilots write in the hours and days before their missions are preserved in a body of documentation that post-war Japanese publishings and scholarship has assembled over decades, beginning with the Kika, Wadatsumi no Koe collection, Listen to the Voices from the Sea, published in 1949 and representing the most systematic early effort to compile the final writings of Japanese university student soldiers who died in the war, many of them in Toko missions. The collection and the scholarship that has followed it reveal a demographic reality about the Toko program that the wartime Japanese public did not understand and that the program's designers did not publicize. A disproportionate number of the pilots who wrote the most searching and most intellectually honest final letters were not career naval aviators, but university students who had been conscripted into the military under the 1943 suspension of draft deferments for humanities, and social science students trained rapidly for flight duties and directed into the Toko program because their short training hours made them unsuitable for the sophisticated combat air patrol and anti-shipping missions that experienced pilots were still required to fly. These were men who had been studying philosophy and literature and economics at Tokyo Imperial University and Kyoto Imperial University in the spring of 1943. By the autumn of 1944, they were being asked to fly aircraft into ships. What they wrote in the hours before their missions reflects the specific collision between the intellectual formation of men trained to examine the world analytically and a military situation that their analysis could not produce any satisfactory frame for. Hayashi Ichizo, a student of political economy at Kyushu Imperial University, who flies a Toko mission in April 1945, writes to his mother in his final letter that he is not dying for the emperor, and not dying for the nation, and not dying for the abstract ideals that official military communication has provided as the justification for the program. He writes, in a letter that his mother preserves and that the Wadatsumi collection subsequently publishes, that he is dying because he is here and because the situation has brought him to this point, and because refusing would require a courage that the specific social and institutional architecture of Japanese military life in 1945 has made effectively unavailable to him. He does not write this as a complaint. He writes it as an observation, the observation of a man trained in the political economy, examining the political economy of his own situation with the analytical tools his education has given him, and finding that the analysis produces a conclusion he cannot act on. He asks his mother to understand that his death is not a sacrifice in the sense that military communication describes it, but a consequence in the sense that his education has taught him to use that word, the outcome of a sequence of decisions made by people other than himself, beginning with decisions made years before his birth about the kind of society Japan would be and the kind of relationship that society would maintain between the individual and the state. His letter is approximately 800 words. It does not mention the Hellcat. It does not mention the American fleet or the specific tactical situation that has produced the Toko program. It does not mention war as a military phenomenon at all. It describes his love for his mother, his thoughts about his studies, his sadness about the things he will not see, and his specific and privately honest assessment of what it means to die in the way he is going to die. American naval codebreakers, reading intercepted Japanese communications in the same period, are producing targeting information that will eventually result in Hellcat pilots of fighter squadrons VF-83 and VF-30 and the dozens of other fleet and light carrier air groups flying combat air patrols over Okinawa in the spring of 1945, being vectored by fighter direction officers onto radar contacts that are Toko aircraft. The fighter direction officers know only that the contacts are Japanese aircraft flying toward the fleet. The Hellcat pilots approaching those contacts know only that the contact is an aircraft to be shot down before it reaches the ships they are protecting. The men in the Toko cockpits, whether Hayashi Ichizo or men like him, know that the Hellcats are coming. They have been briefed that American combat air patrols are the primary obstacle to their missions, and they have been given instructions about how to evade them, instructions that assume a level of individual pilot skill that the accelerated training schedules of 1944 and 1945 have not provided. The evasion attempts that the Toko pilots make in the final minutes before interception are documented in the after-action reports of the Hellcat pilots who shoot them down, and they are described with the specific professional notation that aerial combat produces: altitude, airspeed, angle of approach, evasive action taken, effectiveness of evasive action, rounds fired, result. The result is usually the same. Neither the Americans reading the intercepts nor the Japanese flying the missions know each other exist as human beings. They know each other only as operational data points. Sasaki Hachiro, a student of law at Tokyo Imperial University, who flies a Toko mission in April 1945, writes to his parents and his brother that he has been thinking about the books he will not finish reading and the conversations he will not be able to have about them. He has been reading Hegel and has found in Hegel's description of the relationship between the individual and history a framework that he applies in his final letter to his own situation with a precision that suggests he has been working on this interpretation for some time. He writes that history moves through the sacrifice of individuals and that the movement is not made meaningful by the sacrifice. The sacrifice does not redeem the movement or make the movement more just or more rational, but that it is produced by the sacrifice in a way that cannot be escaped from the inside of history, and that being inside history and understanding, this is the specific condition of his situation. He is not writing a philosophical essay. He is writing a letter to his parents about how he understands his own death, using the vocabulary that his education has given him because it is the most honest vocabulary he has access to. The letter is approximately 600 words. It does not say goodbye in any conventional sense. It does not resolve into a formal farewell or a declaration of purpose or any of the rhetorical structures that the word final applied to correspondence conventionally evokes. It simply ends in the middle of a thought about what he would have liked to study if he had had more time, with the specific incompleteness of a letter written by a man who has been told he has 1 hour before his flight and who has run out of hour. It ends, or rather it is interrupted, untermud, with a description of a walk he took near the training base 3 days before writing the letter, and of what the trees looked like in the early spring light of a March morning on Kyushu, and of the specific quality of the air that morning, which he describes as the most beautiful thing he has experienced in some time. American Hellcat pilots flying combat air patrol over Okinawa in April 1945, are vectored by fighter direction officers onto radar contacts that are Toko aircraft closing on the fleet at low altitude to evade the radar's detection. The Hellcats dive from above, where they have been holding at 20,000 feet in the specific patrol pattern that the fighter direction system has refined through 2 years of operational experience to place the combat air patrol between the incoming aircraft and the fleet. The Toko aircraft, at low altitude and committed to a straight approach, have limited options when the Hellcats attack. The Hellcat pilot sees the target, fires, and the target goes into the water. The Hellcat pilot returns to the carrier, debriefs, eats something, sleeps, and flies another patrol the next morning. Sasaki Hachiro's letter reaches his parents 6 weeks after the mission. American Hellcat pilots flying combat air patrol over Okinawa in April 1945 intercept Toko aircraft above the fleet and shoot them down in the specific, clean, professional way that competent pilots shoot down aircraft whose pilots cannot evade or fight back effectively. A diving attack from 6 o'clock high, a burst from the 6.50 caliber machine guns, and the target aircraft goes into the water. They do not know what is in the cockpits. They are doing their jobs. The men in the cockpits have written to their parents about Hegel and trees. The near failure in the Toko program's management, the moment that comes closest to revealing to the Japanese public the nature of what the program is doing and what it is consuming, arrives in the spring of 1945, when the volume of Toko missions over Okinawa and the losses the program is producing begin to exceed the capacity of the information management system that Japanese military communication has constructed around it. The families of pilots who have flown Toko missions receive notifications that their sons have died heroically in special attack operations and receive no further information. No information about the specific nature of the mission. No information about whether the mission struck its target. No information about whether other pilots survived or were recovered. No account of the circumstances that would allow a family to construct even the minimal narrative of a death that grief requires. The notification is a form, completed in the standard bureaucratic language of military casualty reporting, and it arrives at the family's address by military postal service in the same mail delivery that contains, in some cases, a letter from the pilot himself, written before the mission and held at the base in the standard procedure for managing the correspondence of pilots who are unlikely to return, and forwarded after confirmation of the pilot's death. The temporal juxtaposition, notification of death, and letter from the living arriving in the same delivery or within days of each other is documented in enough survivor accounts of families who received such letters that it can be identified as a regular feature of the Toko program's communication practice rather than an exceptional circumstance. A mother opens 2 envelopes in the same sitting. One tells her that her son is dead. One is a letter from her son, telling her that he is thinking about spring and about Hegel and about the things he has loved, written by a man who is alive in the letter's present tense and dead in the delivery's present tense, and who exists now only in the specific and permanent way that writing preserves people, as a voice whose speaking is unchanged but whose speaker is gone. They do not receive the letters. The letters are held at the bases until after the missions, then forwarded through military postal channels with the casualty notification in a sequence that sometimes delivers the letter weeks or months after the notification, and that produces, in the families receiving them, a specific and devastating temporal reversal. Reading a letter written by a man who was, when he wrote it, still alive, and reading it after they already know he is dead. The government's management of this communication is not, in any single case, dishonest in the sense of misrepresenting individual facts. It is dishonest in the aggregate sense of presenting to the Japanese public a program characterized by heroic voluntary sacrifice when the documentation that the letters themselves provide, accessible eventually to the scholars who compile the Wadatsumi collection, reveals a reality that is considerably more complicated. Men whose relationship to the choice of their own sacrifice was mediated by institutional pressures, social constraints, and the specific dynamics of Japanese military culture in 1945 in ways that the word voluntary, applied accurately, would not survive close examination. By the time the Pacific War ends in August 1945, the TOCO program has launched approximately 2,800 kamikaze missions from all branches of Japanese service, naval aviation, army aviation, and eventually the specially designed Oka rocket-powered aircraft that the program's planners hoped would evade Hellcat interception by being faster than any existing Japanese aircraft, and has produced approximately 475 American ships struck, with 34 sunk and hundreds damaged by varying degrees. No American fleet carrier is sunk by a TOCO attack, though several are severely damaged and temporarily put out of action. The cost to Japan is approximately 3,800 pilots killed in the special attack operations, men who in most cases had been university students or recent secondary school graduates 12 months before their deaths, men whose letters document the specific process by which the institutional machinery of Japanese military mobilization transformed civilians into weapons, not all of them in missions that reached their targets, because American combat air patrols and anti-aircraft gunnery shot down a substantial percentage of TOCO aircraft before they could complete their attacks, and because the Hellcat-equipped combat air patrols that Task Force 58 and the Fast Carrier Task Force had developed over 2 years of operational refinement had become, by the Okinawa campaign, a defensive system of considerable effectiveness against exactly the kind of slow, straight, shallow angle approach that TOCO tactics required. American fighter directors aboard the carriers, using the radar networks that had been developed and refined since 1942, were vectoring Hellcats against incoming TOCO formations at altitudes and distances that allowed the Hellcats to attack before the TOCO aircraft could close to the range where their final high-speed dives were most difficult to intercept. The specific tactical evolution of American fleet air defense against the TOCO threat is documented in the after-action reports of the Task Force 58 fighter direction officers who managed the combat air patrol during the Okinawa campaign, and it represents one of the most direct examples available in the Pacific War of American organizational and technological adaptation, outpacing Japanese operational adaptation. The TOCO program, in producing a new kind of air threat, had produced in response a new and more systematic approach to fleet air defense that the program could not then counter, without becoming something fundamentally different from what it was designed to be. The Hellcat was not the only instrument of this defense. The radar systems, operating at ranges that gave American fighter directors 10 to 20 minutes of warning before TOCO aircraft could close to attack range, warning that was often enough to vector the combat air patrol to intercept altitude and position before the incoming aircraft could commit to their attack dives, were as important as the aircraft. The radio communications networks that allowed fighter directors to talk to multiple combat air patrol sections simultaneously and to reassign each section as the situation developed were as important as the radar that fed them. The fighter direction procedures that the operations teams of Task Force 58 had refined through 2 years of Pacific operations, incorporating the lessons of every previous engagement into a doctrine that was more effective in the spring of 1945 than anything that had preceded it, were as important as the pilots who executed those procedures' terminal guidance. But the Hellcat was the weapon at the end of the chain, and the pilots flying it, men like Commander David McCampbell, who would end the war as the Navy's top ace with 34 confirmed victories, and the dozens of other skilled aviators who built their combat records against the TOCO campaign over Okinawa, were the ones who made the system's output visible in the specific and final form of TOCO aircraft that went into the water before reaching the ships their pilots had been sent to destroy. The men who wrote the final letters are not the story that the Pacific War's military history has most consistently told. The military history has told the story of the technical competition between aircraft, which is interesting and important. The F6F Hellcat's 2,000 horsepower against the Zero's 950, the American self-sealing fuel tanks against the Zero's unprotected cells, the American pilot training pipeline against the Japanese pipeline, whose compression, under attrition, had reduced its output from competent combat aviators to men who could fly straight, and had been told they did not need to do anything else. The military history has told the story of the organizational competition between fleet air defense systems, which is also interesting and important. The American radar networks and fighter direction procedures that allowed Hellcat combat air patrols to be vectored against incoming aircraft before those aircraft could close to the range where their attacks became difficult to interrupt, against a Japanese communications and coordination system that had not developed comparable solutions to comparable problems. These are real and significant aspects of the Pacific War's air campaign, and understanding them is necessary for understanding why the war ended, when and how it did. They are not the story that the letters tell. The letters tell the story of what the competition cost, paid in the specific currency that wars demand from the individuals who fight them and that no strategic or tactical analysis can adequately account for. They are the men in the cockpits that the Hellcat pilots are vectored against. They are the operational data in the combat air patrol officer's log. They are the aircraft designations in the after-action reports. And they are, simultaneously, the authors of letters about Hegel and trees and the quality of spring air that their mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters will receive weeks after they are dead, and will spend the rest of their lives reading and rereading and trying to make sense of in the specific way that the survivors of any institutional violence try to make sense of the institution's accounting of the people it has consumed. The Wadatsumi collection, when it is published in 1949 by the Tokyo University Cooperative as a project of the university's Student Self-Government Association, young men and women the same age as the men whose letters they are publishing, who had been secondary school students during the war and who were in university, now trying to understand what the preceding years had meant, sells hundreds of thousands of copies in Japan in the first years after its publication, and continues to be read and reprinted in the decades that follow. Not because Japanese readers in 1949 are primarily looking for a critique of the wartime military establishment, though the letters provide one simply by existing and being honest about what they describe, but because there are millions of Japanese families who received letters like these, and seeing them in print is the closest thing available to the acknowledgement that grief requires, that what the letters describe was real, that the men who wrote them were real, that they existed and thought specific thoughts and cared about specific things, and were not simply symbols of national sacrifice, but people who had futures that were taken from them, and that the war that consumed them was not the heroic sacrifice that official communication described, but something more complicated and more costly and more specifically human than the framework of heroism can accommodate. The Pacific War produced, as every war produces, its tactical innovations and its strategic calculations and its material balances. The Hellcat against the Zero, the radar against the approach, the fighter direction system against the coordinated strike, the industrial pipeline against the attrition, all of it real and all of it significant and all of it documented in after-action reports and intelligence analyses and historical studies that have been available to scholars and readers for decades. It also produced these letters written by men who had been reading Hegel and walking through trees, who had been conscripted into aircraft and directed at ships, who had met the Hellcat in the last minutes of their lives without knowing the names of the men flying it or anything else about them, except that their aircraft was faster and their training was better, and their government had given them enough time to survive the war and find out what it had been fought for. History remembers the aircraft. The letters remember the men. Both are necessary for understanding what actually happened in the skies over the Pacific between 1941 and 1945, and what it cost to happen there.